C-158, we're back. Dirk's eyes opened after an unknown amount of time. He was immediately fully alert. The next moment, Spite appeared on his chest, her tail flourishing as she spoke. You were asleep for 18 hours. Over a day has passed since you crossed through that portal. It's morning now. All right, Dirk sighed, reflecting on his recent memories. That battle with his sister was exhilarating. Talk about brother-sister bonding. He felt like they had talked about everything they had gone through in the time they hadn't seen each other. In that battle, each attack was a word, each exchange passing along the knowledge of their experiences. Dirk had never felt like that before. For him, combat was a means to an end. He was usually calculative about it, his mind utilizing his uncanny instincts in order to plot the most efficient path to victory. But in that fight, he had fun. That battle was a place to experiment, to grow and hone himself. He and his sister had gone through several phases of development that ended with both of them in a trance. If Viola hadn't dropped when she did, he would have continued for several more hours. In fact, Dirk had been in just as deep of a trance as his sister. However, when she passed out on her feet, he had pulled himself out of it in order to divert his last strike. It ruined it for him a bit, but he didn't mind much. It was much better than taking off one of her limbs. Dirk was pretty sure that Viola was the biggest winner of that battle. Compared to when they first started, Dirk knew that she had advanced her strength by another magnitude. They had both been Rook-class warriors. However, if Dirk was just beginning to enter the depths of that class, then Viola was already there and pushing to leave it. It was like that battle was the catalyst for pushing past a barrier she was at. While Dirk didn't have the same boon, he did begin to understand a lot more about his magic. For one, Dirk was finally beginning to understand his various modes of magic casting. There were several ways to cast and utilize magic. There was standard casting, in which the mage created magic circles. There was silent casting, where they cast magic directly without magic circles. And then there was elemental manipulation, where the mage didn't even use runes, instead relying entirely on his comprehensions to directly manipulate mana and invoke changes in the environment. After developing his stigmata, Dirk never utilized many spells beyond it. The pistol made magic so much easier to cast, and any other magics he used came in the form of elemental manipulation. However, he found a limitation. He couldn't cast large-scale magic. During the battle, Dirk had attempted to cast a complex multi-circle spell. He naturally used his pistol as the medium, but in doing that, he realized that the pistol couldn't cast spells beyond a single circle in complexity. This meant that if Dirk wanted to use more powerful spells like the one Pandora cast, he would need to cast it personally. This wasn't impossible, but doing so was much more difficult without the pistol. Dirk's battles were too fast-paced. He didn't have time to cast a long series of magic circles for a grand spell. He would open himself up to way too much danger. But it also meant that his magic wasn't allowed to surpass a certain level of strength. If he didn't figure out a way to solve that issue, his magic would remain supplementary. He still couldn't see how his magic could become a tool just as or more powerful than his own body and weapons. Of course, that wouldn't stop him from making it more powerful, but he wanted to use the tools at his disposal. Being both a mage and body refiner gave him a massive advantage over those who only trained one or the other, but that would only remain so if his magic could keep up. He also had the advantage of not needing to train himself in martial arts. He was already an exceptional fighter whose instincts afforded him combat ability that rivaled some of the most powerful people in the world. So that meant he could devote most of his time to magic, advancing faster than those who had to train both. There was no reason he shouldn't be able to reach Pandora's level. Dirk slowly leaned up. He got a read on the state of his body, which felt amazing. It was like it had been burned and refined through the fire of battle, which wasn't far from the truth even taken literally. Dirk remembered how much stress he had been put under. Viola was the perfect opponent for him. Not weak enough to fall under his combat senses, but not so strong as to be overwhelming. So he had been pushed to his limits in order to keep up, and technically, he won out in the end due to his greater stamina. Just because his body had been under great stress didn't mean his stamina couldn't go for much longer. If he insisted on going until he died, Dirk could have lasted another day, let alone a few more hours. And the fact that his stamina could surpass someone a full level ahead of him in every respect spoke volumes. By the way, I have a report. What is it? Dirk asked curiously. wondering what was so important that Spite decided to report it. The cat sat straight on his chest, transmitting some data to his mind. I observed your body through your nanites during the battle, and there are two things that I noticed a change in. The first is your blood. At the end of your battle, massive amounts of mana had been infused into your bloodstream. This is by design according to the mana heart technique. But because your blood is no longer human blood, instead supposedly being some kind of dragon's blood, it is heavily accepting of the mana. Long story short, your adaptable genes trait is showing signs of activation, and your blood is moving towards evolution. I'm not sure of the specifics, but that's what all signs point toward. Interesting. Dirk nodded, thinking that this was a good thing. Back when Geralt had mistakenly given him a potion at the academy, Dirk's body expelled all his blood and replaced it with something else. The blood couldn't be identified by his nanites because it wasn't a human variation. Instead, it was blood that could work in tandem with mana, and this blood synergized well with his mana heart technique that infused his heart and blood with mana. Now, it seemed like the increasing mana concentration was beginning to positively affect his blood again. Either way, if it was changing, then it was either improving or properly assimilating to his body and growing power. Unfortunately, Spite didn't know much else, but that was all right. Just keep monitoring it. What about the second change? The second change is in regard to the nanites themselves. Your nanites exist all throughout your body, but their highest concentrations reside within your blood. And because your blood is changing, it seems your nanites are being affected as well. How is that? The nanites are supposed to be a foreign device that isn't affected by bodily functions. Well, that's not entirely true. Spite pulled from her memory banks from when she was just a basic intelligence. Back then, the AI had been armed with the standard programming of Dirk's AI from Earth and knew all about the specifics of how the nanites truly functioned. The technology of the nanites relies heavily on genetic engineering. Your body doesn't accept something unless it becomes a part of its genetic code. So the nanites and their existence is a part of your genetic code. Yet your body treats it like it isn't there, carrying on as normal and letting the nanites operate as they please. In fact, the installation of the nanites was the second biggest cause for psychosis in the supersoldier program, only losing to the AI integration. And that's because of this genetic alteration. I see. It seemed there was much more behind Dirk's cybernetics than he knew. But then again, it wasn't like he was a genetic scientist, so it was normal for him to know little about it. Anyway, because your nanites are a part of your genetic code, they're being affected by the changes to your body. Your new blood, all the mana and anima, and your growing power is invoking change. Your nanites are beginning to affect the mana and anima within your body and work alongside your reformation skill, simultaneously triggering your adaptable genes trait. I'm not sure what this will lead to, but like with your blood, I plan to monitor every change. Sure. Well, thank you for the report. Of course. Now go eat. I'm starving. You're my stigmata, and a part of you. I share your hunger. So hurry and eat. She pawed at him, causing him to smile and scoop her up before climbing out of bed. He walked down after dressing. Dirk had long noticed that this residence wasn't the one back at the capital, but one within that base. He could feel the incredibly dense fire mana despite the house cooling the air around him. And after walking down, he found a funny scene. Well, good morning, Sleeping Beauty. Pandora chuckled as he walked into the dining room. There, his family was seated and eating. Riker and Cecilia sat across from each other, while Ethan sat across from Viola. Pandora sat at the end next to Viola, and across from her was an empty seat. Dirk sat down while Nova, Pandora's personal maid, prepared him a plate. Morning. How are you feeling? Very well. Dirk answered Viola, making her nod. Good. Sorry about going so hard on you. Not that you couldn't keep up just fine. It's all right. How about you? Just how much stronger did you get? Dirk smiled while asking that question, causing Viola to grin, though she tried to stifle it. Quite a bit. I had been banging my head against a wall for a while when it came to advancing my aura and combat techniques, but your insane instincts inspired me. I suppose in terms of sheer power output, I should have gained what was equivalent to half of my previous strength. But on top of that, my technique has advanced significantly. Thank you for that. No problem. Dirk raised the glass of water in front of him, tapping it against Viola's when she raised it. Still, he was surprised by her gains. Not only was she 50% stronger, which was a massive increase. But her techniques had advanced to another level. Dirk wouldn't be surprised if she had doubled her overall combat power. At the same time, he was kind of disappointed. He would love to outright double his combat power, but then again, the fact that he could still fight against Viola's power meant that he was much farther along than he had any right to be. However, Viola sighed. Unfortunately, I've hit another wall. The inspiration was nice, but it feels like going any further is impossible. I'll probably be stagnant for a while. That's normal, sweetie. Approaching rank 7 isn't something most even get the chance to do, let alone do so easily. It took me around a decade to push into rank 7. Cecilia comforted her child, but Viola only looked at her with narrowed eyes. How old were you then, Mom? I believe I was 30 at the time. So it's been over 3 decades since then. So I've got 5 years in order to reach that level to be on par with you. You will take however long you need and not rush it, otherwise you may never advance. My path is not something you should be trying to mimic, because reaching the bishop class is different for everyone. If you're focused on others, you'll never be able to pave your own path to that level. Viola only hummed, seemingly not convinced. Her mother and father were both extremely accomplished people, having reached rank and tier 7 respectively. She was pressured by their talent, especially as the oldest child. But even more than that, she was pressured by her youngest brother, Dirk. She had finally realized just how talented he was, and it was overwhelming. It was like he had a straight shot to the top so long as he was given time. The fact that he could fight on par with her, who was an entire 8 years older, had her feeling like her talent was pitiful. She had even been inspired by him, if that wasn't bad enough. Things like that only happened when facing someone far superior, and she had no choice but to admit that Dirk's combat ability was immensely superior. That combat ability was the only reason he could fight against her. Usually, a person's combat ability grew alongside their power. As they accumulated anima over time and developed strength, they would also begin to face stronger enemies and hone their skill. They would rise together, stably entering each level. But Dirk's skills far surpassed his power. As far as she knew, only rank 8s could display that kind of skill, and that was due to their colossal strengths. So to do so at such a young age and low power level was anomalous. And from the side, Ethan was feeling the same way. In truth, he was inferior to his sister's power. She was older, so he couldn't quite keep up. But Dirk had actually come in and matched her. Did that mean he would lose to his younger brother? He made a note not to end up in a spar with him. Unlike his sister, he held on to a certain amount of pride as an older brother and wasn't quite ready to have that pride crushed. Hey, Mom. Suddenly, Dirk spoke as they ate, causing Cecilia to look up at him. He asked, "Where can I find Alec?" "That boy? He's here. Actually, you wanted to see him?" "Yes. I promised to say hi to him." "Very well. Your father will find him today." To the side, Riker nodded with a smile. "I can do that." "Heh, I've heard some things about that boy. He's quite the character." "How so?" "Well, let's just say that the girls can't seem to stay off of him. In fact, there was quite the scandal a while ago. Apparently, the girl he fooled around with during our diplomatic trip to the Dark Kingdom scurried on over to Horizon and glued herself to him. Now she fights with him on the battlefield here. But the real kicker is when she got challenged by another girl and lost. So now the kid has 2 girls pining over his sorry ass. Haha, that kid is gonna have quite a few wives once he settles down. I can't imagine." Riker couldn't stop laughing as he spoke, and his words caused Dirk's brows to raise in amusement. It seemed his friend was busy while he was gone. He really wanted to say hi now. See what kind of headache he earned for his charming self. C-159, Alec. After finishing morning breakfast, everyone left to take care of business. Ethan still had his duties as a marshal, as did Riker as a grand marshal. And Viola worked closely with Ethan, so she wasn't without responsibility. Cecilia also went with Riker to go and find Alec, so that left Dirk and Pandora, along with Exos and Nova. Nova's stuck by her mistress, as always, waiting to receive an order or tend to her. As for Exos, like during their ride here, he was focusing on his enchanting. For many weeks now, Exos had been doing nothing but studying and experimenting, improving his augmentations alongside his growing knowledge. He hardly talked or socialized, and preferred to stay locked up in a room somewhere. So although he had come to this base, he didn't come out of the house. The specifics of what he was doing was beyond Dirk and Pandora, and they didn't know how long he would be like that. The only occasions that he emerged was when he sought Pandora for her knowledge. That was becoming rarer, but it still occasionally happened. Not that they minded. Their time at Horizon was meant for accumulation and strengthening. Pandora had already expressed how she intended to use this time to increase her magic power. She was able to break into Tier 5 whenever she wanted, but apparently she wished to create her domain first. Naturally, doing so was extremely difficult, especially for her. Domains were usually created when someone was Tier 5, so not only was Pandora a step behind, but she had 4 attributes to make use of. It would be a complex process, but without a doubt, once she finished, her power would leap once again. And soon after that, she would advance another level, giving her another boost. She didn't wish to leave Horizon before these things happened, so when they left depended on her. But it wouldn't be quick, at least a couple months, possibly more. That being the case, Dirk planned to work heavily on his magic as well. He may not necessarily create his domain, but he wanted to at least get close to Tier 5. For the time being, that was his primary focus. But first, Dirk. We found Alec. Dirk smiled when he received the news, making his way to another section of the base. I got you right. That lizard is mine. Then I got the lava buffalo. On the battlefield, 3 people swam through a crowd of scattered monsters. Around them, rivers of lava bubbled and ashy soil kicked up dust with every step and disturbance. Behind them, there were more squadrons of soldiers, all of them moving in the same general direction. And their destination was the large monster a small distance away, a being that lived within a lake of lava. Their mission was to subjugate this newly developed monster general. It was currently only sitting at Tier 6, but the nature of its power to wield fire and lava combined with its home made it an especially tricky foe. These monster generals would crop up frequently as days and weeks passed, requiring regular missions to be run in order to keep their numbers low. However, there were some generals that were harder to kill than others, and if the initial missions failed, then the general would grow and require a stronger team to take it out. Alec and the 2 women fighting beside him were one of the teams called on in order to kill this lava monster, along with 4 other teams. Of course, unlike the other teams that had 4 people each, Alec only had himself and the 2 girls. This was naturally due to their relationship, and nobody was willing to be the 4th wheel stuck with this competitive group of lovers. Alec glanced at the 2 girls who shot ahead of him, attacking some monsters who got in their way. The first girl was a vampire, with slightly pale skin. She was a subtle beauty who had pitch black hair and a reasonably tall height, standing only a bit shorter than Alec. Her eyes gleamed with silver light as she cast all kinds of dark spells, cursing her enemies before calling upon her domain to strangle and destroy them. The second girl was human. She had blonde hair and was only slightly shorter than the vampire. Her lithe figure covered in thin silver armor dashed between her enemies with finesse and grace, all her movements chaining together with stunning technique. Her greatsword carried constant momentum, every strike only serving to increase its power. It was clear that the sword technique she trained in was top class. And then, there was Alec. Clad in thick red armor, he wielded a large spear as he swept through several enemies at once, fire and light blooming from the tip of his weapon as it crashed into hordes beyond. Each of his steps were powerful, each of his thrusts or sweeps carrying unrelenting force. He was like a general on the fiery battlefield, his momentum acting as the momentum of every team in the vicinity. And he was in fact in the lead, acting as the spearhead for their entire effort to carve a path to the monster general. It wasn't long before everyone arrived under his guidance. Alec jumped, planting his feet at the top of a pointed boulder that overlooked a large open pit before him. He saw the massive lava monster, their target, sitting inside a massive lake of lava. They couldn't even reach it unless they made their way across the lava. And the only solace was the fact that no monster dared to even approach the lake, making it completely clear. The 2 girls caught up a few seconds after Alec, standing beside him while cringing as their faces were hit with a wave of heat a few magnitudes worse than the already oppressive atmosphere. The dark mage, named Magenta, was using her dark mana to interfere with all the fire mana that radiated from the lava lake. As for the knight, named Ivory, She utilized the enchantments of her armor as well as her anima to resist the heat. But even then, she couldn't stop herself from sweating, though she didn't seem to care. Alec! Suddenly, there was a call, all three of them turning toward a man who jumped over. He was their captain for this mission and a Tier 6 Earth Mage. He was their greatest assurance against the lava monster, as no normal fire mage would be able to do much. Knights were especially helpless. Alec nodded. Captain, good job cutting your way here. You can leave the rest to us. Also, I received word from base that your presence has been requested, so you should head back. Go back? Why? Not sure. Just relaying what I heard. Besides, I don't want you getting hurt trying to fight this monster, so don't worry too much and go. We got it. Very well. Good luck. With that, Alec turned around as the captain shot off toward the Mossener along with the other teams. Alec descended a small hill, but just as he was about to start running, Magenta narrowed her eyes. Hold on, she spoke, causing them all to stop. Ivory glanced at her from the side. What is it? I sense something. A spatial fold. Ivory went quiet, looking ahead of her and trying to pick out any anomalies. Then, Alex suddenly equipped his spear, lowering his body. His helmet-covered head scanned the surroundings. Then, only 3 meters away, a figure suddenly appeared. It startled all three of them, causing each of them to prime for battle. The figure was dressed in black scale armor. His helmet was sleek and the armor intricately crafted. He also held a black sword in his hand, one that vibrated through space like it was going to disappear from reality at any moment. The hand that held the sword twirled around, as if playing with the sword like it was a toy. The tip of the sword left behind streaks in space, dark mana trailing like a tail. Ivory's pupils constricted as her heart rate rose. She felt great threat from this person. Who are you? He was quiet. His gaze settled on Alec, and then he took a step before suddenly disappearing. That's when Alec spun around, his spear swinging before colliding with a blade behind him. Ting. Void walking. Magenta called out as she started casting spells. At the same time, her domain was extended. Ivory also pressed forward. It seemed like this dark figure wanted battle, so they intended to give it to him. After the clash, the man shot backward. While he did so, tendrils rose up from the ground, threatening to chain him down and inflict curses. But before they could, another weapon appeared in his hands, and when he pointed it, dark projectiles shot out, blasting apart the tendrils and poking holes in the domain. Magenta grit her teeth, realizing that this dark mage had some special spells and weapons at his disposal that she had never seen before. Even his void walking barely resembled actual void walking. It was some kind of twisted spell that manipulated space and warped his body into multiple places at once. After that, Ivory pressed forward, her blade gliding through the air before arriving before the figure. According to her technique, she only needed to hit something once before she could cascade into a rhythmic flow of sword strikes. With every hit, she would apply further pressure, and once it started, it would become increasingly difficult to stop it. Thus, she intended to lock this figure into her own flow, allowing her team to attack from other angles. They had used this tactic against many powerful enemies before, especially those more powerful than them, and every time, it resulted in their victory. But before she could even start, she was forced to a grinding halt. Tang! Her sword collided with that black blade, and all the momentum she had been gathering was dissipated just like that. She was locked into place by that dark figure, as if he knew exactly what not to let her do. She couldn't help but feel like she was being read like a book, her evaluation of this person rising every second. But this wasn't her only technique, so she shifted and prepared to overwhelm him with power. She swung again, but this time, when her blade was about to collide with his sword, he suddenly shifted. Her greatsword was deflected, its tip digging into the ground like she was a toddler wielding a sword for the first time. And then, the dark sword came swinging around, using her momentum to deliver a strike of his own. She could only use all her strength to dodge, the blade creating a streak across her shoulder pauldron before slicing off a few of her hairs. It was so close that her neck tingled, and even then, she felt like this person wasn't really trying to hurt her. Then, a spear appeared in the corner of her eye, and that man was forced to abandon her to defend. She recovered as Alec pressed forward. His spear jutted forth dozens of times. All the while, Magenta cast various binding and cursing spells, anything to try and pin that man down. But he merely shot those mysterious bullets, and all of her spells were nullified. It baffled her to see him dealing with both Alec and her spells at the same time. And after Ivory recovered, she went to help pressure him. Magenta continuously cast spells while both of them attacked. But no matter what she did, she couldn't lock him down. Sometimes his bullets would destroy her spells, but other times, he would outright shoot her, forcing her to block with the power of her domain. She couldn't seem to take a step without being disrupted in some way. It frustrated her to no end. Ack, damn it, she cursed, feeling like she was being played with. So with that shout, she poured power into her domain, casting a grand spell comprised of 7 circles. More bullets flew over, but all of them were directly blocked by the domain. It cost her much more energy, but nothing less seemed effective. As she cast the spell, she was constantly paying attention to that figure. Ivory and Alec were both combing their attacks, and they were putting immense pressure on that figure. He was on the back foot the entire time, but the fact that he could even last a minute was baffling. His combat sense was beyond her comprehension. But then, she eyed that sword in his hands. For the most part, its enchantments weren't being activated. But at some point, when he received enough pressure, she could see them activate. When that happened, the sword flickered and disappeared, his arm going with it before appearing across his body, blocking a sneaky blow from Ivory. When she saw that, her eyes widened. The Sword of Dissonance. You're from the Dark Kingdom. Who are you? Did my father send you? I refuse to go back. I don't care if he doesn't approve of Alec. Magenta cried out. She knew about that special sword, one that was stored in the royal treasury of the Dark Kingdom. It was famous for being the strongest Tier 6 sword, a masterpiece even greater than many Tier 7 weapons. And its deceptive nature had long earned it an exemplary battle record by its few wielders. But it was as powerful as it was difficult to wield. Not anybody could use that sword because it required great magical comprehension and elemental manipulation, as well as a strong body that could handle its use. After all, if your limb was teleported a short distance, shooting across the folds of space at high speeds, then it would naturally be placed under atrocious pressure and be torn apart. Unless, of course, you could keep yourself together with an equally strong body. Who was it that could wield this sword? And how did it get taken out of the treasury? Magenta wasn't privy to everything, but the reappearance of this sword would surely be big news. And because this man was here, she was beginning to think that her father had sent someone for her. But these words of hers also caused the man to stop for just a moment. His sudden moves caused Alec and Ivory to be thrown off. Both of their blades glided past him as he stood straight. He looked at her before she suddenly heard a laugh. Hee, that's funny. Hey Alec, where the hell did you find this one? No way. After the man spoke, Alec suddenly jolted and took off his helmet, looking at the dark figure with wide eyes and a smile. Dirk, that is indeed my name. Dirk smiled as his armor retracted, revealing his face and suave appearance. Alec's spear then disappeared as he dashed over. Shut up, asshole. Bring it in. Ack. Dirk grunted as Alec scooped him up in a bear hug, squeezing him with all his strength. Dirk had to put in quite a bit of effort to resist. When he was finally put down, Dirk took a deep breath before laughing. You've gotten stronger. Me? What about you? Taking on all 3 of us by yourself? I was really beginning to think you were sent by Magenta's dad. And who exactly is her father? He's a Duke of the Dark Kingdom, Duke Hullen, a dark mage only underneath the Vampire Queen. Well, isn't that something? I guess you really did beat me that night. That night? Oh, yeah, I did. Once he remembered what Dirk was talking about, Alec broke out into a goofy grin. Then, he wrapped his arm around Dirk's neck. Actually, I had been thinking that you were the biggest winner back then. After all, I wasn't the one who walked away with the princess. Speaking of, where the hell have you been? We can talk about that later. I just came to see the 2 ladies you managed to tangle yourself with. Oh, right. Let me introduce you. This is Ivory, and this is Magenta. Ladies, this is my friend, Dirk. Alec introduced them, Dirk smiling and nodding to both. But both seemed wary. Magenta was the first to push past that and nod. Pleasure to meet you, Dirk. If I recall correctly, you're Dirk Strider? You were at the Advent, yes? I was. I see. Magenta went quiet, her thoughts complex. As for Ivory, she stared at Dirk with wary eyes, barely mustering the will to sheath her sword. Dirk glanced over at her, and as he did, Alex spoke. Ivory here is the daughter of the fourth prince, making her a granddaughter of Emperor Horizon. The Emperor's granddaughter? Hey Ivory, do you actually like this guy? Or is he blackmailing you? It's okay. You can tell me the truth. Asshole. Dirk dodged a kick after asking Ivory that question, making her smile a bit. She spoke with a thoughtful face. I wonder. Hey, there are some light spells that can make people fall in love with you. Maybe he cast one of those. Dirk spoke as he continued to dodge Alec, who was chasing with a pointed finger. Hey, stop spewing lies. Ivory, don't be deceived. I would never do such things. Face it, Alec, they're both too pretty for you. Stop casting the spell and face the truth. You're just jealous of my brilliant charm and pretty face. No, I like my handsome appearance more. You could never match my maturity. Alec and Dirk continued to banter, causing the two ladies on the side to smile and snicker. They only stopped when a monster finally disturbed the peace, being dispatched as rapidly as it appeared. After that, they all made their way back to the base where they could properly talk. C-160, Stalker. Wait, I was called back to report. Oh, that was my father. Dirk waved at Alec, making him relax. It was Riker who had given the order for Alec to return. After that, Dirk found a spot on the edge of the massive walls of the base, overlooking the entire battlefield beyond. Now they could talk in peace. Dirk glanced over to the two girls beside Alec. Both of them were rather extraordinary. Magenta was the daughter of a duke and Ivory was the daughter of a prince of the Horizon Empire, granddaughter of Emperor Horizon himself. The Emperor, with his long lifespan, naturally had several children, and over time they all had children as well. But this wasn't to say that the Emperor's reign was coming to an end. On the contrary, he would sooner outlive his children and grandchildren. Unless someone challenged his authority with absolute power, for the next several hundred years, he would reign supreme. It was a good thing that he was a benevolent ruler, or at the very least, not a corrupt one. Either way, Ivory was the descendant of a very powerful man, coming from a very powerful family and raised with nothing but the best teachers in the Empire. And yet, she fought Magenta over Alec, making Dirk wonder what the hell his friend had to do in order to so thoroughly win their hearts. Well, Alec was charming, and that charm was only growing the more he got older. Alec was a bit older than Dirk, having turned 17 while Dirk was still 16. He was beginning to age a bit more, especially since he entered the military. He was no longer as naive and bubbly as he was when young. Now, he carried confidence and responsibility on his back, seeking strength while trying to protect his empire. Still, it amazed Dirk to see him being fought over by two girls who seemed no less talented than him, even boasting greater backgrounds. Well, Dirk wasn't worried about his friend. If anything, he found it amusing. This polyamorous relationship would be fun to watch. Then again, in the back of his mind, Dirk was secretly taking notes. After all, there was still another girl that he would have to explain himself to at some point, and Alex seemed to know how to handle two women. I shall learn from your mistakes and successes, Dirk muttered in his mind as Alex spoke. So Dirk, what exactly have you been doing all this time? Oh, exploring the world and trying to keep myself alive. Boring stuff like that. Heh, I wonder what kind of trouble you've been stirring up. I wondered why you didn't want to join the military, but I suppose when you have the princess pulling you along, you can't exactly say no. Alex snickered, causing Dirk to shrug. His mission with Pandora was indeed something he couldn't ignore. Not that he would join the military anyway. So where specifically did you go? Dwarven Haven. Pandora had some business there, so I got to explore their capital city built underground. Wow, I've always wanted to go. Where else? That's it, but we plan on going to the other world next. Oh, that's a long ways away. We'll make do. Dirk smiled, thinking about how they would be taking an airship this time. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't stand it if they were only able to drive. That also reminded him to check out the production facility his mother told him about. It was there that an experimental airship was being created, and they would need to steal it. Well, Pandora was good at those kinds of things. Dirk knew that from experience. So with their cumulative effort, he didn't believe they couldn't nick an airship. Alec continued to talk, and Dirk continued to tell various stories about his trip, besides what he couldn't. They also talked about combat, specifically their little fight on the battlefield. I still can't get over how you took on all three of us. I thought I had been getting better, but apparently it's nothing in front of you. I agree. Ivory suddenly chimed in. If anyone felt most oppressed during that battle, it was her. Dirk had utterly crushed her techniques. I know two techniques. The first is the dragon dance, perhaps the most powerful and elaborate greatsword technique in the Empire. The second is the King's Art, a much more direct but far more devastating technique. And I couldn't do anything to you with either of them. I noticed your technique. Are they really the best sword techniques in the Empire? Yes. They are techniques that have been honed and built upon for hundreds of years, passed down across generations, and put to the ultimate test countless times. They are the longest standing and some of the greatest techniques in the world, along with the most complex. Is that right? Dirk smiled weirdly. He didn't know how he should feel about being able to suppress those kinds of techniques. However, he also realized that such techniques couldn't possibly be utilized to their fullest by this girl. And she also seemed to know that, but that didn't stop her from questioning him. How did you do it? Don't tell me you saw through the entire technique and figured out how to counter it. No, I just stopped you from being able to use it. Your dragon dance requires a rhythm, so I didn't allow you to start one. What about the King's Art? It's designed for head-on collisions. I just deflected it. You know that better than I do. Dirk's smile caused her to frown. Her utter defeat had been properly carved into her mind. But more than that, Dirk's unbelievable skill had inspired her even more. Only, it was so beyond her that she couldn't wrap her head around what Dirk found to be obvious. Seeing her conflicted face, Dirk sighed. Look, you say that those techniques are complicated, but maybe you need to simplify it. You couldn't even touch me because one or two blows was enough to shut you down. You were so reliant on your techniques that you forgot to adapt to the situation. Sometimes you need to shift your focus from executing techniques to just fighting. That's counterintuitive. Techniques are meant to amplify basic fighting techniques, affording you an advantage through the skillful delivery of power. Yes, power delivered in different ways produces different results. But it was obvious that your techniques weren't doing that for you. So you either need to work on your techniques more, or go back to the basics. Then again, you don't really need techniques for that in the first place. Maximum power can be produced by simply swinging your arm. Look, Dirk suddenly took out the Sword of Dissonance. However, it was completely deactivated, not even affecting the space around it. He raised it in his right arm, his hand rising above his head. Then, it swung down in a simple arc. Slice. Ivory watched, seeing the wind be torn in two across his blade. And when the blade stopped a foot or so above the ground, its power continued without it. Crack. The ground shattered underneath it, creating a thin line and some cracks. Ivory's mouth gaped, her eyes widening. She didn't sense aura or mana. This was created purely from the strength of Dirk's body and his natural effects on the surroundings. The atmospheric anima, for example, was dragged along the blade of his sword until it was released when he halted his strike. But he didn't even need to channel his own anima to move it. And although it was a simple strike with no technique behind it, it delivered immense power and weight. After all, not just anything could damage the walls of this base. Monsters scratched and launched attacks against it all day, yet it still stood strong. But one strike from Dirk, and it was cut. Without anima, Ivory couldn't hope to do that. Of course, Dirk didn't think it was anything special. He put the sword away and shrugged. It doesn't have to be complicated. Break things down into their simplest components, and everything becomes simple. I don't know any techniques, and yet I was able to nullify yours. That was because your swings were simply swings, and I was simply able to use my sword to stop yours. No, it's not that simple. Ivory shook her head in refusal. Then, she looked Dirk deep in the eye. I can understand why you think it's simple, though. You're a combat savant, an heir, I dare say. Reading your opponent and understanding how to fight them comes as easy to you as breathing. You don't even have to think, and you already know exactly what to do. Your instincts are as good as someone who had fought countless battles over hundreds of years. Well, I wouldn't go that far. Dirk scratched his cheek in slight embarrassment. He knew he was greatly talented in the field of combat. Ivory was right. He didn't even have to think, and he could fight someone he had never fought before. Regardless of their techniques or skills, he was adaptable, calculative, and ruthlessly accurate. Combined with his skills given to him as a super soldier, and in an equal battle, he wouldn't lose to anybody. So when he spoke about things being so simple, he also knew that those words came purely from his perspective. Others would see Ivory's techniques and be enraptured by their complexity and intricacy. When faced with it, they would fall into her rhythm, slipping deeper and deeper as she pushed them ever closer toward death. But Dirk had merely watched it for a while and was able to nullify it. It was like she couldn't swing her sword without his permission, being dominated in every way. And she didn't have the overwhelming strength like Viola did, able to break through Dirk's skill with strength and put him on the back foot. The fact that anybody could overcome him at all with just mindless power was something Dirk thoroughly hated. But that was the reality in this world, and he was forced to make do. But if they lacked that power, there was nothing they could do. Ivory wasn't strong enough to break him down, and anything less meant that she would lose no matter how many times they fought. Of course, Ivory found it hard to accept. It was beyond her how someone could be so perfectly attuned to combat. It was like Dirk was a weapon himself, existing for the sole purpose of fighting and killing. That's also when she noticed how he was blindfolded. He wasn't even fighting her with proper eyesight. She wondered, if he were armed with proper techniques, then just how strong would he become? Or, if Dirk was right and her Dragon Dance and King's art really were too simple, then what would happen if he made a technique of his own? Or, perhaps that very notion was counterintuitive to his style. Dirk could adapt to anything. So it wasn't wrong to say that the very concept of a technique was too limiting. On the side, Magenta nodded in agreement with Ivory. But then, she thought about Dirk's magic. His magic wasn't anything unimaginably complex or overwhelming, but it was still peculiar. They were bullets and fired from some kind of odd tool. They were also shockingly fast and carried enough power to disrupt all her spells. She had never seen anything like it before. She also noticed how Dirk hadn't formed his domain yet. On top of that, there was his stealth. She had barely been able to notice it, and that was because she had a perfect dark affinity while being taught at the world's leading kingdom for dark magic. Dirk was a lower tier than her, so the fact that his stealth had been so good at all was shocking. Eventually, everyone concluded that Dirk was a monster. Ivory and Magenta's evaluation of him only rose the more they thought about it. Alex suddenly spoke. "Heh, you guys should have seen him when we were at the academy. He had been just as insane back then." "Yes, and it's good that you've at least gotten decent since then. By the way, since when do you use a spear?" "Since I realized it was a better fit a couple years ago." "Well, it looks like you need more experience with it. Compared to your girlfriend, you still have some ways to go." Dirk snickered, causing Alec to look away in embarrassment as Ivory shot him a small smile. "She doesn't have to work on magic." "Excuses. Is not. Hey, spar me. We just fought, though." Dirk shook his head. Then, he suddenly turned his head. Nearby, Pandora leaned against a wall, having arrived unnoticed. She was looking over with a smile. Seeing as Dirk finally found her, she walked over. The others also turned, and Magenta's eyes bulged. "Princess Pandora, it's an honor." "At ease, Magenta." "Hello, Alec." "Ah, Princess. Good to see you again." Alec smiled and bowed a bit in greeting. Pandora nodded and took up a spot at Dirk's side, leaning against him casually. Dirk just continued standing against the edge of the wall. At the same time, Ivory narrowed her eyes. The intimacy between them was obvious, but Ivory was more concerned about Pandora's identity. Pandora noticed the stare and smiled. "Greetings, Ivory Horizon." "Greetings, Princess. How's your father, Tristan, and your brother? I heard he's recently attempted to break into rank 5. I hope there wasn't ac." Pandora suddenly flinched as Dirk pinched her side, interrupting her words. "Stop it. I was just talking normally, being a nice conversationalist." "You were being weird. You sound like a stalker." "I do not." "Then don't ask about someone's father and brother when you meet them for the first time." "Fine." Pandora huffed, looking away. Ivory just stared from the side, feeling like this whole situation was something she never thought she'd ever see. It was a weird impression to have of the mysterious Princess Pandora, who only several months earlier was about to launch a war against Horizon. C-161, Processor. After Pandora arrived, Dirk and Alec continued to talk. It seemed like her presence made Magenta and Ivory more reserved, but the boys didn't care about that, so they went into their own little world after ignoring the weird atmosphere. It was Magenta who eventually spoke up, engaging in conversation with Pandora. Like that, the two were locked in discussion, talking about the affairs of the Dark Kingdom, among other things. Pandora also talked to Ivory about her sword techniques, something she didn't mind talking about. Like that, the two groups socialized for a while. Dirk and Alec were especially talkative, never seeming to run out of stories or topics to choose from. Unlike the girls who seemed stiff and formal when talking, they were completely casual. They had always technically been friends, but their friendship had been one-sided for many years, not even mentioning the fact that they hadn't seen each other for years. Despite that, though, Alec still took Dirk as his friend and never let those things get in the way. And now, Dirk was finally in the position to reciprocate. Even Alec noticed how Dirk was far more open. He had first seen it during their time at the Dark Kingdom, and it was even more pronounced now. And Alec had always been an outgoing and social person, so despite Dirk still being generally reserved, they seemed to fit well together. And now that Alec had gone through the military, gaining a plethora of experiences, Dirk could relate to him much more. Unfortunately, the girls weren't exactly in the mood to just stand there and watch them talk, so eventually they all went their separate ways. That left Dirk and Alec to spend the rest of the day doing whatever they wanted, and when evening came by, they decided to head to one of the few restaurants in the base. It served high-class food aimed toward the powerhouses that were stationed here. This meant it cost a pretty penny, but both of them were quite rich. Alec was the son of an influential marquis, and Dirk had the bottomless wallet known as Pandora. Neither were lacking gold, so they got whatever they wanted, their talks continuing on into the night. During that time, they talked about everything there was to speak of, all kinds of stories from their travels, their experiences in combat, the intricacies of magic, and even their relationships both with family and the girls in their lives. After enough time, Dirk was basically completely open, sharing some of his struggles while only hiding more confidential secrets. He talked about the endlessly long road to power, as well as all the conflict going on in the world that he would surely be embroiled in. He also spoke of his conflicts with Pandora and Ava, the only two girls who had managed to find a place in his heart. And Alec was a good listener, giving advice while asking introspective questions and offering the wealth of his experiences with Ivory and Magenta. And some of his words surprised Dirk. There was a reason Alec had two girls by his side. In fact, he spoke of two others besides Ivory and Magenta who were trying to wiggle their way into what Dirk could only assume was Alec's growing harem. Such a thing could only happen because, in this world with extreme power scales, a man having many wives was actually rather common. On Earth, a man could attract mates by having money, charm, and good looks. Here, power was the most attractive trait a man could have. As for women having harems, it wasn't unheard of, but men were generally unwilling to submit like that. On the other hand, women were more willing, especially in this world. Of course, this didn't make harems common either. It was really only seen at the top of the power hierarchy. So while Alec wasn't quite there yet, for him to be so strong while so young meant that he would surely reach that height in his life. Not only that, but Alec was charming, smart, kind, and came from an influential family. He was quite the perfect bachelor. It was no surprise then that he was forming a harem. Of course, Dirk had no plans to go that far. Alec already had 4 girls, and Dirk was panicking over the possibility of having to deal with 2. Alec found it funny, but Dirk didn't have any experience in this regard, so he was taking it seriously. In the end, Alec gave some good advice and lots of food for thought. Dirk would need to spend a while sorting himself out, but at the very least, he wasn't as panicked. And there was one detail that gave him more solace than even the fact that harems were common for talented and powerful people. That was, hybrids were a race of people that practiced polyamory very frequently, far more than anybody else. If anybody was accepting of it, it was them, and Ava was a hybrid. And although Ava had been raised in a human empire, she was now within the hybrid empire, surrounded by her kin and their ideals. After so much time, There was no doubt that she had been exposed to that concept if she hadn't already been. So Alec guessed that she would be understanding. Of course, Dirk still felt guilty. There wasn't anything that could change that, and Alec's words were mainly just to try and comfort him. And it worked to some extent. When night came and both of them decided to retire, Dirk left greatly satisfied. He felt like he got a lot of things off his chest. After all, you could only connect with certain people in certain ways. He couldn't speak with his mother or Pandora like he spoke with Alec, just like he couldn't be comforted by Alec like he was his mother, and couldn't be intimate with anyone like he could be with Pandora. But it seemed like he was filling all those roles. A close friendship, an intimate relationship, and a loving family. As time passed, Dirk was finding himself more and more fulfilled, finding the things that he was never able to have in the past. Perhaps that was one of the reasons he opened up to Pandora. With her, he could experience intimacy he never had before. It satisfied a part of him he never knew he had. He couldn't help but think about that as he returned to their residence on the base. When he returned to his room, most of the family had already gone to bed. His father, brother, and sister all had to fight, so they needed their rest. On the other hand, Pandora was waiting for him in his room when he returned, wide awake and casually practicing some magic in a nightgown. She smiled when she sensed his presence, turning to him as he sat on the bed she was lounging on. Have fun? That's good. Alec is a good kid. His girlfriends, on the other hand, I'm not completely fond of. Ivory could be a bit less stuck up. She carries the arrogance of a noble child raised in a shelter. That's because she's exactly that. But that doesn't make her a bad person. You can be quite arrogant as well. Dirk smirked, causing Pandora to roll her eyes. My arrogance is simply confidence in everything I do, built upon experiences that she couldn't ever fathom. But yes, I suppose I can't blame her for being shaped by her environment. To expect otherwise is unrealistic. Still, seeing you shatter her worldview with a simple swing of the sword was quite enjoyable. Pandora chuckled, and Dirk also couldn't help but smile. He couldn't deny that he also found it amusing. Anyway, Pandora suddenly changed topics, speaking in English. We can't spend all our time here playing. We've got business to attend to. We both need to train, but we also need to acquire intelligence on that airship we plan to steal. You need to ask your mother about whatever facility it's being produced in and do some reconnaissance. It'll take a while to plan our attack, so we better get started now. How much time are we going to stay here? Well, at minimum, we'll be here until we get that airship. But otherwise, I intend to stick around until I form my domain and advance. I'm guessing it'll be a few months, because forming a domain out of 4 elements is proving to be much more difficult than I expected. All right. Dirk nodded, thinking that he could afford to spend his time more generously than initially planned. Then, Pandora suddenly shifted toward him with alluring eyes. For now, though, let me get a sip of that luscious blood, and I'll be sure to reward you generously after. She climbed on top of Dirk, going for his neck, and he didn't resist. Afterward, they tumbled over each other for a while before going to bed, Pandora being much more vigorous than the night before, and Dirk not as reserved, taking in everything she was offering with less remorse and more pleasure. After that day, Dirk and Pandora's schedule became somewhat routine. Pandora was wholly focused on her magic, as was Dirk. In fact, he began another training regimen with his mother, absorbing everything she had to teach about dark magic while refining his spells and techniques, especially stealth. He even got some training from his father, learning some large-scale fire spells from him. While Dirk didn't generally prefer to use large spells, it was never a bad thing to have more weapons in his arsenal. Unfortunately, Riker didn't know anything about lightning since he didn't have the specialization, so Dirk could only continue studying the lightning crystal he received from the Dragon Yuvos. On top of all that, he also received information about the site of the airship factory. It was a standard factory if you looked past the extra layer of security compared to other buildings. It was located toward the edges of the capital city as it covered a massive plot of land, comprised of a few huge warehouses along with what looked like 2 hangars. Not only was it a factory, but it was also a maintenance facility. Dirk could see airships occasionally dropping into the hangars, some of them battered from battles, others looking completely normal. Unfortunately, he couldn't enter the premises as the entire area was walled off. He would need to sneak in, and from a quick scan with his manavision and a few discrete manipulses, he found that there were plenty of magical security measures that would hinder his advance. But that could all be operated around in time. At least now, he knew where his target was located. Now, he just needed to find this airship specifically and figure out a way to break it out of the facility. He and Pandora spent some time brainstorming ideas, and they came up with a general plan. Facilities like these couldn't be broken into and out of with brute force. Pandora knew everything there was to know about breaking into high-security facilities, and not all of her experiences involved using violence. She decided to infiltrate the place by merging with the staff. To do so, she would need to gain the clearance to enter in the first place, which would involve finding the right people to grant her that clearance and station her there. Because of this, she decided to use some of her tools. She had 4 of them, and they were all somewhat influential figures within the military and government. These spies of hers could be activated and give her what she needed, allowing her to enter the facility and gather intelligence while working with Dirk to figure out a way to break the airship out. This would take time, though. Not only did she have to get in contact with these spies, but they would need to do their work before she could get in. And when that happened, Pandora would put a halt to her training and infiltrate. So she got the process started while Dirk simply waited. After that, a couple weeks passed. During that time, both of them continued to train while Pandora received daily reports on not only the situation within the facility, but information about the identity she would need to assume and who she would be working with. Just like that, she was given a fake set of credentials and an entire backstory for her fake life. Every possible detail was there, from her parents to her time at the academy and her interest in engineering magical devices. She even utilized a magic tool that disguised her entire body, making her a completely different person. Not long after, Pandora disappeared into the facility. She would go there as if it were her standard job, and Dirk would visit her in the nights, receiving reports. From that, they gathered much-needed intelligence, and Dirk was surprised by Pandora's ability to not only act, but gather information. She let nothing slip. Magic alarms, the layout of the facility, the strict security, the doors and barriers, the materials of the walls and structures, the daily routine of the various facility sectors. She definitely had experience with everything. But with every new report, they slowly understood how tough breaking into the facility would be, let alone breaking out of it. Their main difficulty was the security, and not the guards, but all the automated magic sensors and alarms. If Dirk wanted to get in, he would need to either scramble or hack them. And while Dirk had been taught how to do those things at Azura's Mountain, he didn't learn enough to deal with high-level security enchantments. So Pandora continued her work, spending an entire month acting as a completely different person while constantly gathering even the smallest details that might help Dirk infiltrate and figure out how to carry out the mission. But then, they were met with 2 unexpected surprises. The first was in regard to the airship, their target. Turns out, the airship was a massive experimental project that, to some extent, had already been completed. The ship was called the Sky King, and it was the great culmination of many years of research and constant upgrades. It was a project that never ended. The Sky King was never deployed, instead being upgraded whenever a new technology came out. It was generations ahead of anything currently in use, and that was because it was the vehicle that was responsible for testing every new and bleeding-edge piece of equipment. So they at least didn't have to worry about their target not being able to fly at all. But that was only the first surprise. The second surprise was that, at the 2-month mark since arriving at the capital, Exos finally dragged himself out of seclusion. Dirk and Pandora had gradually forgotten about him since he never left his room, devoting every hour of every day to whatever convoluted work he was doing. But one day, he finally emerged, and he brought with him a shocking piece of news. In the Strider household, Dirk stood in Exo's room. He had come after receiving a message from him, but in the room, Dirk could see nothing but papers and books strewn about the place. All of them were filled to the maximum with enchantments, many of which Dirk couldn't make the slightest sense of. And Exos sat behind a table. In front of him was a small metal container, inside which was a glowing mana crystal. Exos himself looked ragged and emaciated, the bags under his eyes making it look like he hadn't slept at all in the last 2 months. But he was smiling with such genuine glee. One might think that he had cracked the secrets of the universe. "I've made it," he muttered after Dirk entered, looking at the container before him like it was his baby. The processor, containing artificial intelligence driven entirely by magic enchantments. I dare say that, on this day, I have revolutionized the entire field of enchanting. In the future, all will bow before my skill and hail me as the greatest mind that has ever graced the coming world of industrial magic. C-162, Domain. Exos gave his bold declaration while Dirk continued to observe the metal container sitting in the middle of the desk between them. Dirk found it hard to make sense of what exactly he was seeing while he looked at the container. At first glance, he found it difficult to discern anything special about the container. It almost looked like a rock in terms of its mana signature, nothing but a mass of dense earth mana. But when he looked closer and focused his vision, concentrating all his power on strictly that container, he found his head hurting. It was like a star in his vision, lighting up with unfathomably complex circuits and runes. Whenever he focused in on these runes, it felt like he was looking at a formation far beyond his means to comprehend, and the sight gave him a headache. Exos called it the processor, and that name clearly came from Pandora's knowledge of computers. It seemed he had created a processing chip, but instead of a physical one, it was made of runes and enchantments. When Dirk looked at it, he could see thousands of small pieces within that container, all of them being enchanted with different kinds of formations. And there were certain clusters of these pieces that were interconnected in various ways. Dirk didn't know much about how computer chips worked, but regardless, he knew that what Exos had created was no small mimicry of modern technology. He had created an actual magic processor. It was no wonder he had been working on it for several months now. His expertise in precise enchanting combined with inspiration from Pandora's future knowledge resulted in this monstrous creation that knew no match. Exos leaned forward, stroking the container like it was his child. I've designed this one to be a general-purpose mana processor. I have several other ideas for more specialized processors, such as one that can operate my augmentations and one that can become the brains for golems and weapons, but that will have to wait until I do more research. For now, I will operate this first-generation processor and code it to carry out any task we need. You've really gone above and beyond. Dirk wasn't sure what to say. Exos was nothing short of a savant. It was no exaggeration to say that he had advanced enchanting technology by decades. Sure, it relied on Pandora's knowledge, but Exos still had to pave the entire path by himself. In the end, Pandora's knowledge was merely ideas for Exos to mimic with magic. Of course, he would only revolutionize the industry if this processor was released, but that wouldn't happen. Pandora wouldn't allow it, and Dirk was already getting ideas on how this processor could help them. He thought for a few moments before speaking. You said you can code it? Then I'll ask for your help. We need to break through some magic security formations. Can you code the processor to do that for us? Break security formations? I suppose it wouldn't be that difficult, depending on the strength of the formation. Some formations simply rely on sheer strength to repel invasions, while others use their power to cycle dozens of redundant conformations a second in order to scramble attempts to crack them. This processor can get around both so long as I make the right program, even though it would take a while. And in the time it would take to program it, I may as well make another processor devoted toward cracking formations. Exos continued talking himself into another brainstorming session, taking a minute or so before Dirk clapped to catch his attention. Hey. Huh. Oh yes. Your question. I'm assuming from your words that you know enough about security formations to combat them. In that case, how long will it take you to get me a processor that can break them? Dirk asked directly, causing Exos to lower his head while mumbling. 6, 8, 9 weeks. Yes, 9 weeks and I'll have a processor that can break whatever formations you throw at it. 2 months. Dirk frowned for a moment before sighing. All right, go ahead and work on that. Keep us updated. Yes, I will. But first, I need sleep. Saying that, Exos leaned back into his chair. And after a few seconds, Dirk could hear snoring, making him chuckle a bit. After that, he left and went to go report to Pandora. When she heard the details, she too was shocked by Exos' achievement. He's seriously smart to do that so fast. If he learns more and develops magic that can threaten us. Stop it. You're the one who led him down this path. Don't blame him for simply acting on what you gave him. Still, we need more power to secure ourselves against him. Pandora frowned, not at Dirk's reprimand, but at her thoughts of the future. What Exos had made today was merely preliminary. He had many years ahead of him, and he would only continue to advance this processor technology until it became comprehensible only to him. It would possess power beyond anybody's ability to make sense of, capable of driving powerful machines of magic that knew no bounds. It was the spark that would ignite a flame of ambition and pave the way for endless destructive capability. Pandora likened it to a nuclear bomb, except Exos was currently the only one with the knowledge to make it. Suddenly, she looked at Dirk, thinking for a few seconds before smiling. Luckily, he trusts us almost unconditionally. That, combined with your covert powers and talent, means that there should be no point that Exos can defend himself against us should we need to kill him. Say that to his face and he'll never trust you again. Don't worry. I'm quite good with secrets and mind games. Pandora smiled even wider when Dirk didn't actually reprimand her for that statement. Truthfully, Dirk felt slightly threatened by Exo's genius as well. With Pandora's backing, her knowledge, his own intellect, and the key artifact of Earth, it was hard to tell just how vast his future would be. If he wasn't careful, Exos would overtake him and become impossible to kill. And if there was anything Dirk hated, it was the inability to kill someone. That was what he hated most about this world, because he had become very intimate with the concept of powerlessness, something that could only be found in this world full of people with world-shattering power. So he didn't disagree with Pandora's statement or evaluation. Nonetheless, Exo's abilities may soon become their ticket to bigger and better things. Pandora knew this as well, and she immediately started making plans. I'll need to gather schematics on the airship and its systems, along with all the security formations we need to crack so Exos can prepare thoroughly. There's also the issue of piloting the ship. We'll either need a person we can trust, or Exos will need to develop a processor specifically to drive the ship and operate its facilities. For that, we'll need some navigation systems and references. The ship doesn't exactly have much of that since it's only occasionally used. So perhaps I can develop some of my own systems in tandem with Exos and implement them. Pandora started diving into her own world of schemes, one that Dirk couldn't follow after a little while. But with all that, they could finally see the way forward. Pandora had initially been stuck, thinking that they would need to use force in order to get this airship out, relying on absolute chaos to distract the powerhouses and make out with their prize. But it seemed like they could use tact and trickery instead. Her smile gradually widened as she cackled with every new idea, her excitement growing as she seemed to bring everything under her clutches of control. And so Dirk waited and prepared, ready for the time he would need to step up and execute these plans that relied on the support of those around him. Week after week passed, and Dirk continued to train his magic. Pandora also trained when she wasn't occupied with her other identity. One thing she did was bring ideas back to her new workplace and begin to implement them. These ideas were the fruits of her cooperation with Exos. The two communicated frequently after Exos finally finished his processor, and Pandora didn't hesitate to use Exos' expertise to impress and manipulate those at the factory. She took every step necessary to secure the airship for herself, but as a result of pulling Exos' attention, the time needed to create a security processor grew. At some point, for more months passed. In total, it meant they had been within Horizon for 6 months. A new year came. Dirk turned 17, as did Pandora. The world gradually calmed, the initial turmoil from the outbreak of war cataclysma subsiding, and hidden powers began to churn, emerging from the darkness of the world's empires. Dirk had initially felt a sense of urgency after they had spent a certain amount of time in one place. After all, the other key artifacts were still out there, and there was no telling what may happen to them. But in a rare moment of strict logic from Pandora, she explained that their power wasn't sufficient enough to acquire the rest. The failure to capture the key artifact of Earth that was now in Exo's possession hit her hard, and now she would take no chances. They both knew that power was absolutely necessary, especially when they traveled to lands where they had no authority or influence. In the Dwarven Haven, they had been able to use the power of the Dwarven armies and a Tier 8 in order to wear down a key artifact. But even after all that, it still escaped their grasp. So in a place like the Elven territories where that would be impossible, they needed to rely on themselves. It would be useless, even counterproductive, if they were to rush over there only to be forced to wait and accumulate power. They may as well do it at Horizon. which was friendly territory, while also acquiring a powerful means of transportation. Their time here was more valuable. So with her words, Dirk calmed and focused. And he was constantly active as he sought to push his power forward every day. Most of his time was spent studying magic. In fact, after a while, he no longer sought his parents' tutelage and focused on himself. Tier 5 of the Mana Heart Technique, a state where one formed the true Mana Heart. In order to form the Mana Heart, Dirk needed to figure out how to merge his pools of mana. He needed to merge fire, lightning, earth, metal, and darkness together. His Mana Heart would then become a universal pool for all his attributes, allowing him to use any amount of any element as much as he wanted. It would increase his efficiency by several times, but even more than that, it would bring a massive boost to his magical power. The Mana Heart Technique was more than just a method to manipulate or store mana. Any ordinary technique could do so, but what made the Mana Heart Technique special was all the other functions it had. The most important one was the infusion of mana into the user's blood and the integration of the Mana Heart into the physical heart. The Mana Heart Technique sought to make the user and their magic power a singular whole. Their magic would not be a mere extension of their body or extraneous tool to use, but a core part of their being. During his earlier advancements, Dirk had experienced the changes in his soul. The technique opened up large cavities in his soul which were filled with mana and engraved with the runic formations the technique made him comprehend and create. Dirk wasn't sure exactly what this did or if it afforded him any major advantages. The main advantage he was clear of was the fact that he had a mana pool significantly larger than ordinary Tier 4 mages. Pandora was the same, as it was a perk of their pure soul. But the Mana Heart Technique also changed how Dirk manipulated mana. It could be said to be the biggest reason he could utilize certain techniques like stealth that required elemental manipulation, not spell formation. If mana was flowing throughout your body as a part of it, then that meant you were no different than the mana that composed you. If you activated stealth using this logic, then its effects would be several magnitudes greater. In this case, the Mana Heart Technique was almost built for elemental manipulation. Perhaps that was the reason Dirk often preferred to use it that way, as well as the reason why he could do it so well in the first place, especially factoring in spite. Dirk had learned all this throughout the 6 months of his constant training. These inferences came along with the comprehensions of all the runic formations within the Mana Heart Technique book itself. So not only did he begin to realize how to properly utilize his magic, but he also learned exactly how he needed to advance his magic. Finding common ground between each element seemed impossible since they were separate elements. But Dirk had actually experienced an example of common ground not long ago. The fight between General Umangit and the key artifact of Earth. At the climax of their battle, the key artifact had seemingly done the impossible. By gathering the immense power of Earth, it had actually created a miniature black hole. Dirk had sensed how it warped space, which was a concept under the jurisdiction of darkness. In that case, Dirk had already found one common ground between Earth and darkness: gravity and space. And the book provided other examples within its incredibly complex runic pages. Metal mana was a specialization of Earth mana, and therefore, the two were one and the same. But metal mana was actually more capable of affecting space and gravity than standard Earth mana was, so Dirk chained his metal specialization to his darkness attribute. And then, there was fire and lightning. For this, Dirk also looked toward his experiences. Fire and metal. When one thought of these two things, forging was likely a concept they would drift toward. Heating metal and then bending it under weight and impact was a technique as old as civilization. In that case, the temperature affecting materials, specifically high temperatures, was a common ground between the two. Temperature was intrinsic to everything, so Dirk could make the connection and chain fire to Earth mana. And he could chain lightning to metal mana, as some metals were good conductors of electricity. Some were even magnetic, and lightning was simply electromagnetic radiation and plasma, like fire. These concepts were one and the same, establishing the connection. Not only that, but lighting needed a medium to strike. Lightning was the discharge of electricity between 2 points, and metal was the perfect medium, even better than the air between thunderclouds which lightning iconically struck through. Thus, Dirk established another connection. However, this was where he encountered a wall. The connection between fire and darkness. These two concepts were often considered completely opposite to each other. In Tales of the Origins of Humanity, Fire was the greatest and most important creation ever made. Fire drove away the dangerous darkness of night, allowed us to purify the filth of the food and water we consumed, and eventually allowed us to create the tools that built civilization. These were all properties that one associated with the light element: purification, creation, and light. They were all antithetical to darkness. But Dirk found that there was another facet to these elements through his comprehensions of the mana heart technique. Within that book were endless observations and materials to study, all of them providing information on the nature of the elements and magic itself. And what he learned of were two concepts that many had thought of before, but not truly taken seriously in the realm of magic: the concepts of order and chaos. Light was aligned with order, but within all order was chaos, and this aspect is how fire was allowed to connect with darkness. Fire brought creation, but it also brought destruction. In fact, it was most known for its ruinous nature, despite how it was also responsible for the construction and livelihood of all civilizations. And destruction was very much aligned with darkness, otherwise thought of as chaos. This was the connection Dirk made between the two. He had lots of experience with Eldritch Primordial and knew exactly what true chaos looked like. So he didn't have issues finding that in fire, and with that, he had bridged them. But these connections were only the beginning. Dirk knew where the common ground lay. After enough time, he knew that every one of his elements could be transformed into each other, seamlessly creating a singular mana heart. But, not betraying the difficulty of such an amazing technique, creating the mana heart required Dirk to also form his domain. In fact, his domain would be directly integrated with his mana heart and form the foundation for its function. This was where the difficulty lay. Dirk needed to create his domain, a technique that would embody all of his elements. But domains were much more than just some fancy magic spell. They were, in a literal sense, established territories. Magic domains would impose your will upon the world around you, turning your magic from mere superficial manifestations into a miniature world that would seek to force everything to bow to your rule. In a battle, a domain would afford you absolute control of the mana around you, stifling your opponent and directly nullifying spells, so long as it was powerful enough. It also didn't need to be thought about. Domains would activate and maintain themselves with nothing but a desire. At least, that's how good domains were supposed to operate. Poorly created domains were difficult to maintain, representing the lack of knowledge of the creator. In fact, in standard magical society, the quality of a domain was determined by how long you could maintain it. 5 hours was considered good. A day was considered amazing, making your domain one of the best. But according to Pandora, a perfect domain could be activated and maintained forever. It wouldn't drain any of your energy, and in fact could supplement your power. People like the Vampire Queen and Emperor Horizon had these kinds of domains, and it was why Pandora needed so long to form hers, as it would be made from 4 elements, something not even those monsters could match. And Dirk wouldn't settle for anything less. Thus, the challenge took another leap forward. But that didn't stunt his progress. In fact, as time went on, Dirk only advanced faster. His power grew with his comprehensions. His instincts called to him and led him down the right path, his intuition being his guiding light. Dirk merged his elements, learning how to transform one into another. Darkness became fire, fire became lightning, lightning became metal, metal became earth, earth became fire, and every combination in between. And he developed his domain around the traits of these transformations. A domain with the gravity and rigidity of earth, the spatial warping powers of darkness, alongside its corrosive, covert, and oppressive natures. The protective, conductive, and heavy power of metal, the heat and destruction of fire, along with its ability to soften and mold that which refused to be, and the speed and explosiveness of lightning, with its ability to latch to a medium and transport itself seemingly instantaneously across it. Dirk took all these things, with all their versatility, and made them one. Each trait, each nature, could be merged together just like the elements they entailed. And so they were. Dirk brought together his elements, and because they were tied to each of his mini mana hearts, they all underwent a change alongside his guidance. Each mini heart formed a connection, and they cycled mana between them. Each element transformed, and their activity caused a field to appear around Dirk's body. The traits of his elements exposed themselves as Dirk became aware of it, manifesting in the form of real effects on his surroundings. The gravity strengthened, multiplying the weight of everything around him. Space became rigid like metal, but the power of fire softened it simultaneously just for him. Lightning sparked through the malleable space, connecting to every inch of the domain, as if ready to send his body through the folds of space with speed that seemed to surpass light. And the darkness concealed it all, producing a dark fire that sought to break down anything it touched, igniting the very air. And the concealment of stealth meant that nothing that occurred within the domain could be recognized. Within that domain, Dirk was king. He was the master of all mana, and this was especially so for his darkness. Because his dark element was constituted of source mana instead of standard mana, it led to one amazing effect. All dark mana was expelled from the domain, becoming a field that rejected anything that didn't stem from the source. So against dark mages, Dirk would have no equal, and there was nothing that could affect him within his domain. Any soul that attempted to encroach upon this rule would be killed or suppressed.